Oh my Lord, it's good to know.
Great celebration cup.
We've had one whiskey, and we're already talking about getting arrested.
Yeah.
This is not going to end well. I'm your host, Jeff Sart. We're going to take you behind the scenes with the craft distillers who are pouring their heart and soul into crafting the next version of America's spirit. This is the Great American Whiskey Cookers. On this edition of the Great American Whiskey Cookers, we are headed to Riverside, Illinois, and we're going to go to Quincy Street Distillery. Now, this is a distillery that is very small, 2 people, and they're making so many different whiskey expressions, I can't even keep count.
And one of them, this one right here, is a 4-month-old bourbon.
It is.
And it's good.
It is good. It'll surprise you. Derrick, the proprietor, tells history through the whiskey. It's turn-of-the-century whiskey. This is an episode that you're really going to want to check out. We are here in historic Riverside, Illinois, right outside of Chicago, and we're at the Quincy Street Distillery. We're going to find out what Derrick Mancini is making and what all of his whiskeys are about. This is the Great American Whiskey Cookers. Welcome to this edition of the Great American Whiskey Cookers. We stopped here in Riverside, Illinois, and we're at Quincy Street Distillery, and we're talking with Derrick Mancini about his whiskey and everything he has going on. So, Derrick, give me a little bit of background of you and how you got to whiskey.
Okay, sure. I didn't get to whiskey because I initially wanted to make whiskey. I thought originally I was going to do is make wine. I have a little summer house. I recently had a summer house that was up in Southwest Michigan. And we wanted to make wine in the area. And one of the things we learned when exploring that was that it's really hard to make wine every year that's of quality in Southwest Michigan. So we came up with the idea of doing something they do in some parts of Europe, like Portugal, where they often have poor vintages. And what they do with the poor vintages is they distill them. The classic thing to do is to make aguardente in Portugal. And so we thought we'd do something similar. We'd make grappa or brandy in the bad years. And in fact, bad years make good grape for things like grappa, because it has more flavor and aroma. And then we would make wine in the good years. And then we spent about 4 years trying to make all that happen without success. And while that was happening, Illinois created the craft distiller's license, and we actually have our home here in Riverside, Illinois. And we decided to use a building that had just been renovated, the one that we're in, and try setting up something here. But instead of doing it as a winery distillery, we just decided to do it initially as a distillery, because if it's hard to make wine in Southwest Michigan, it's even harder in Northern Illinois.
That would make sense to me, yeah.
Right. So that means we ended up being about doing distilled products. And one of the key things was how to orient what we were going to do in terms of distilled products. Now, as a consumer, I'm interested in all kinds of spirits and wines and beers, and so I am a whiskey drinker, but I hadn't originally planned to do much in the way of whiskey in Michigan. The tradition of the farm distiller goes all the way back to the founding of our nation, and in fact the biggest farm distiller when he died in the United States was President George Washington. So there's a tradition of that. So that tradition is what inspired what we were going to do here in terms of making whiskey one of the main products that we made, particularly corn-based whiskey, and trying to do that in the way it would have been done in the early part of the 19th century.
And so your branding, you built your branding around that, correct?
Well, around that, but also around even the earlier history. So one of the things I did is immediately look into the history of the area to think about how we might tie to the history for branding. And one of the things I learned very quickly is that unlike most of the villagers here who think that history stops at 1869 when the village was founded, there's actually a very important history of the area that goes all the way into the 18th century. So one of the things very unusual about this location, which is right in the oxbow of the Des Plaines River, is that this was the center of the fur trade industry in this region all the way into the 18th century. Oh. That's because it's the oxbow of the Des Plaines River, which means it's the shallowest part, so the Indian trails crisscross through there. They became all the first country roads, so this was sort of that nexus. But also a couple miles south from here on the river is something called the Portage, which was supposedly discovered by La Salle. Actually, the Potawatomi Indians told them that's where it was, and that connected the east and west river systems for trade. And as a result, all the French fur traders centered their trading activities at this location. There was so much activity going on here that they even named it after a very famous French city, Lyon, And today we all know that as Lions because that's how we mispronounce many of the French names here in Illinois.
Right.
And that became an important center of commerce long before the states even formed. So that's what's going on here. And when I live on the next street, which is Lawton Road, and I was curious, like, who's Lawton? Because all the names picked were usually of some historical significance. And I found out that the Lawton brothers were two fur traders who came here in the 1820s because of the trading boom going on here for furs. They came here, David and Barnabas Lawton, because David Lawton's wife was a Potawatomi princess, and she probably owned thousands of acres in the area. And when they set up shop, they set up a couple miles south of the portage. They set up what will become the most important, largest trading post in the area, Lawton Trading Post. But you wouldn't want to live in a trading post because you probably have a tannery there. So they lived up here where almost everybody else was living. And in fact, Barnabas Lawton built a very large home, which eventually became a tavern and inn, which was not unusual for a merchant. And it became the most important tavern and inn in Illinois at the time. So that's what's going on here, right?
So you got a lot of history,
a
just
lot
kind
of history
wrapped up in.
Right, exactly.
Walk me through some of the branding and what you got going on.
Okay, so the thing for us is, as I said, we want to do 19th century style spirits in many cases.
Okay, so 19th century style.
What does that mean?
Let's unpack that and just exactly what does that mean compared to today's whiskey.
Sure. So the main thing is that in the latter part of the 19th century, many of the distillers, mostly for cost reasons, are switching over to use of tower stills for the production of whiskey. Prior to that, whiskeys would have been done in pot stills. Okay. In fact, columns weren't even used on pot still whiskeys prior to the middle of the century, because essentially the first plated column was made in about 1848, if I remember correctly, for Armagnac. And by the time you get into the post-Civil War period, many distilleries are either using hybrid stills that are pot stills with columns on top, or they're using these tower stills, which are far more efficient. And in fact, today you even have craft distillers to increase production who might use the column still for doing their initial distillation, then switch over to pot still for final distillation.
And you're using?
Pot still. And for the whiskeys, we're using pot still with no column. So that's true pot still whiskey.
Okay.
And that's very traditional for the whiskey that would have been made in the earlier part of the 19th century.
Okay.
And that's what we were trying to be about. We were trying to make whiskeys the way they likely would have been made by a farm distiller in this part of the country.
Okay.
So that means we're doing whiskeys that are double distilled, and we've been very typical, and we're doing it in a 60-gallon pot still.
Okay.
And the result is a completely different flavor profile.
So when you say a completely different flavor profile, what does that mean? As a whiskey drinker, I set that down in front of me and I put it on my palate. I start nosing in and I put it on my palate. What am I looking for? What am I getting?
What you're getting is more grain flavor.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's what you're going for.
That's what we're going for. We're trying to get that flavor profile. What you see is that when you go into the column stills, or when you do distillation with a small column on top of a pot still, or if you triple distill, you are going to reduce the number of the congeners that are in there. These are the flavor molecules that are coming directly from the grain, as opposed to what you'll later get from putting down in oak. And that is probably considered almost desirable for a modern whiskey. They try to get as clean a flavor from the base spirit as they can.
Sure.
And they're relying more on the process of aging in large rack houses, sniff and time of oak on the whiskey. But early 19th century whiskeys wouldn't have been like that. First of all, most of them weren't aged intentionally at all. You were drinking most of the whiskeys unaged. There's one specific exception to that rule in the early 19th century, and of course that would be bourbon. Bourbon would have been always shipped in a charred oak barrel to its final destination, and that meant it always got some significant oak character from the wood as well as from the char, because they were using charred oak barrels.
So let me ask you this question. I ask this question of all distillers. Why should somebody try your whiskey versus Big Bourbon?
Okay.
What brings them? What should bring them to your whiskey?
I say two things would bring them to try our whiskeys. Number one, it's a flavor profile that's distinctive from any of the major brands because of how we make it. And number two, that flavor profile we think is historic. And if you're interested in understanding what high quality early whiskeys were like, then you want to taste it.
And we're not just talking about young whiskey. We're not. You have some 2-year whiskey, but I also noticed you have some 7-year. You have a 9-year rye.
Yeah, so we like to say if you taste our whiskeys, particularly if you taste our bourbon series, which is all from the same mash bill, you're going to taste the history of the 19th century. First of all, you're going to taste what bourbon was like originally. And modern bourbon and the original bourbons are nothing alike whatsoever. Most people don't realize, first of all, bourbon was initially made in Virginia. It was made there as a corn-based whiskey that was shipped in charred oak barrels. Where do they get that from? Nobody knows for sure.
Right.
But we believe it's something they observed because it was something that was used for aging cognac, and cognac is what was brought by the French fur traders in the region. Also, we think the name comes from that. Old Bourbon is what they called the region, and so that was often put on the barrels. But when they first moved to Kentucky Territory, which I believe was in the 1780s, they went there for the limestone spring water, maybe to avoid federal excise tax. But the main thing they were doing was they were commonly using the limestone spring water because of its lack of iron. And many distillers within a couple of years were there. And so once Kentucky becomes a state, they carve out a section of the big county they're in and they create a new county called Bourbon County, which some people think is where the name comes from for the whiskey, but that's sort of backwards. It's probably named after the whiskey. And so this style of whiskey would have been made from corn, a wide variation in mash bills, from all corn to maybe just barely 50% corn. And then it would have been shipped off in charred oak barrels. But now you have to think about what were those barrels, because they probably weren't anything like the barrels that are used today. Today we use a 53-gallon standard barrel. That's a post-World War II size. Prior to that was 47 to 48 gallons. That was the correct size at the end of the 19th century. But if you go to the beginning of the 19th century, the barrels are probably much smaller, probably 10 to 20 gallons. And why were they so small? Well, think about it. You have to send them to the tavern owner. There's no bottling till the 1870s. And the tavern owner is, God knows where they are. They're out, they're everywhere, they're anywhere.
Right.
You have to get it to them. How are you going to get it to them? On sled, on your back, on horseback?
Right.
You're not going to ship it in a very large barrel. That's one thing we know for sure. We also know this specific style of whiskey, bourbon whiskey, which is corn aged in charred oak, was considered one of the highest qualities at the time. So one of the things that's interesting is right after the Louisiana Purchase, there's a bunch of whiskey dealers in New Orleans. They're even taking out ads about bourbon, and they describe it specifically as this whiskey that has a ruby color and a smoky flavor from the use of charred oak barrels. So we know that's what the whiskey is. Now here's the weird thing. You get a smoky flavor from charred oak in all the whiskeys that are aged in charred oak within about 3 months. But after 9 months, it disappears. So this is just proof, I think, that bourbon was drunk in small barrels very young.
Okay.
Can we prove this? No, we don't have any documentation.
Right.
It's all
There's nothing
gone.
there.
But this is the little bit of documentation we have, the descriptions, and imagining how they had to do the business. Not only that, if you're in a little 10-gallon barrel, your angel share loss after a year is going to be so much, you're not going to want to do that. And your extraction that you're going to get is so much out of a small barrel because of the surface to volume ratio that after 6 months, you'll over oak. You won't even be drinkable. So we think the original bourbons were shipped in 10 to 20 gallon barrels of charred oak, and they were aged for between 3 to 6 months. Most of that aging probably just in transport. And the tavern owner decided when to tap it and when to drink it. And we make that kind of bourbon. That's the first whiskey we made. Okay. And we do it in a 10-gallon barrel. We age it for 4.5 months. And it has a redder color and has that smoky finish. We call it our Old Oaky and Smoky.
Fair name.
And it is, it's delicious. And if you don't know it's 4.5 months old, we have people in the industry tasting it blind, and we say, okay, how old do you think it is? And they'll guess 2, 3, 4, 5 years. They have no idea. It's just, you can't tell. So you can make these quote unquote baby bourbons quickly. That's nice.
Right.
And that's why we started out with it. But you can make them bad or you can make them good.
Sure.
We make one really good. It's won us the most gold medals. And people often think it's one of the best whiskeys we make. It's one of our most popular whiskeys.
And which one is that?
That's Bourbon Spring. If you notice, these other whiskeys are labeled Lawton Brothers,
Yep.
which means they're named after our turf fur traders.
Right.
So Bourbon Spring is the one I described, made in small barrels. But the Lawton Brothers series are representing what happened to whiskey after the bourbon whiskey after the Civil War, which is going into the Civil War, getting better and better methods of transportation. As that occurs, they're starting to use larger barrels because they can ship them around. In fact, by the 1830s or so, 30-gallon barrels are appearing as the standard barrel for beer barrels, and the distillers are probably using them just because that's what's available.
Sure.
By the time you get to the Civil War period, 40-gallon barrels are starting to become standardized for the beer industry because now you have trains, you have canals, you have steamships, and the distillers are probably using the same size barrels. A lot of this is not properly documented. The only reason I even knew the 30-gallon barrels are probably correct is because some of the early distillers' textbooks in the United States refer to the 30-gallon barrel.
Oh.
So that's the only way to do it. It's hard to know because none of the distilleries are really extant that go that far back.
Right.
Most of the distilleries in some part of the United States would have been burned down during the Civil War, for example. So what is Lawton Brothers about? It's about seeing what's happening as they're going to these larger and larger barrels. And as bottling becomes prevalent in the 1870s, the whiskey dealers are now having to intentionally age the whiskeys. And they have to age them longer because the bigger the barrel, the less extraction you have in the same amount of time.
Sure.
And so they're starting to age the whiskeys, and the federal government notices this. So the federal government starts taxing whiskey in the barrel when it gets to be 3 years old. So our 2-year-old version is a medium full-size cask. This is actually, let me get another bottle here. This is the 2-year-old version. This is the first one we did. This is probably what you will be getting very soon after the Civil War.
Okay.
And it's got a very specific flavor profile. It hasn't pulled a lot of tannins out yet, so it's got some vanillins from the oak. It's got a caramel nose and a very sweet corn body, and not much of a finish to it. It's our light and sweet sipper, summer on ice, let's say.
Okay.
If you want to get more tannin, you sit in the bottle longer. So if you go to 3 years, you're getting about the maximum tannin extraction. And now we get something that has definitely a woody bite and tannin in the center and a little oak on the nose and the oak on the finish. And that's our 3-year-old. But as the distillers started to bottle the whiskeys going into the 1880s, they are often now using larger barrels, the 47, 48 gallon size, because they don't have to ship them anywhere. And that means they have to be in the barrel even longer to get anywhere near the amount of oakiness that gave bourbon its original reputation. Now they're going to be in there 4 years, 5 years or more. And that's a problem because they're paying tax on the whiskey when it's 3 years old. And then they're also getting angel share loss after they paid the tax.
And so storage-wise, your storage rack house is right behind us, right? And you have all of your barrels here.
Yeah, everything's done on site right now.
On site, correct?
So it's very small, right?
How many barrels do you have in storage altogether?
Just 100.
And is that a pretty constant number
Yes,
for you?
right now it is. That's sort of our we sort of work toward that as a steady state. About half of them are full-size barrels and half of them are smaller barrels.
Okay.
And you know, if we really were to expand to be a much larger distillery, we'd probably have to relocate because of the requirements in terms of physical utilities.
So how many barrels are you producing, say, a month? If you're trying to stay around that 100, and that leads me to how many barrels are you
Well,
bottling
it's a mixture between large and small barrels. We're probably talking about on the order of like 4 barrels
a month, give or take.
Since the pandemic, we were producing as high as double that rate prior to the pandemic.
Okay.
And to do that, we have to have an assistant distiller working with the full distiller in order because we're really working the still all around.
And who's doing the distilling? Is it you?
No. Well, I will sometimes help out, but lately I've not done very much of that at all. I used to work almost hand in hand with the early distiller, but now Cody Vitek is my head distiller.
We're going to meet him.
Yeah, you're going to meet him. He's been working with us for many years now, and you took over in 2019 as head distiller? Yeah. So he's been with us since then.
Hey, we're standing here in the still room at Quincy Street Distillery, and I'm standing with the head distiller, right?
Yes, I'm Cody Vitek. I'm the head distiller, and I produce everything here.
How long have you been the head distiller here?
I've been the head distiller for about 4 years now.
Okay.
Prior to that, I was the assistant distiller with the previous head distiller, and he taught me everything here, and so just naturally progressed.
Fantastic. So this is your still, your whiskey still, right?
Yes, this is our 60-gallon copper pot still. It is the workhorse here. It does probably 95% of all the distillations. The only thing it doesn't do is vodka because we physically can't achieve those proofs on this.
Right. And that's a Vendome still. That's where you guys got it from.
Vendome. It is electrically fired. It is a bain-marie? There's the word. So water heated heats the mash. heats everything up, and yeah, distills.
So how long does it take you to run a distillation since it's a pot still?
So a full spirit run, which is our second distillation, will take about 10 to 11 hours. It is a full day. When we're doing strips, it's about probably 5 hours each. So they're full days. And then combine that with doing mashes, it's time consuming.
So how many days are you running the still?
The still is running about 4 days a week right now.
Okay.
And that will get us enough, it'll get us our mashes, it'll get our strips, and it'll get our spirit runs enough to be at a fairly steady state.
How much did it cost you to start up your distillery?
Oh, well, we tried to grow it organically, which, by the way, I will say is we learned a lot of things, hard knocks. Growing a distillery or brewery organically is actually not necessarily the best way to do it, unless it's a secondary business off of another one, because economies of scale are so important. I can't easily expand as a result.
Right.
So the initial investment was, I'm probably a few $100,000. The total investments into this business now is probably more on the order of $1 million.
Okay.
And we're tiny.
Right.
So if you go to start up a distillery, you have to be thinking of making that kind of investment, unless you're going to be one product, unbelievably niche, very limited distribution,
Right.
simple retail sales. And whiskey's the toughest because most of that money is sitting in the rack house
Yeah.
as inventory.
Yeah, it's not like a shirt or something that you can make and sell and
No.
get it out
So-
the door.
Right.
When you put it in the barrel, what's your barrel entry proof?
It probably varies between, and he's a good person to ask all these questions of too, it probably varies between maybe as low as 110 in some cases. We've done that, not very often, all the way up to about 118. We seldom go up to as high as like 120. I'm sort of of the opinion of some of the other historical experts, like people like Michael Beach and such, who have suggested, really one should probably going in a little bit lower proof than traditionally they were going in at. If you go in at lower proof, you'll just get less alcohol loss in the angel share, so that it doesn't really matter if you're aging for any significant amount of time. But you're going to change the flavor profile because you get different extractors at different proofs in the barrel. So,
Right.
But I think most of the stuff's around 115 to 117.
Okay, fantastic.
We said we do historical whiskeys, so the most historical whiskey we do is actually this one, which is North American Steamship Rye. That's not rye whiskey, that's malt rye whiskey. Malt rye whiskey is a very interesting category. We believe malt rye whiskey was the first whiskey made in the American colonies.
And why is that?
Well, because they wanted to make malt whiskey. So you have the British with the Scots coming to Virginia, you have the Dutch going to New York. The Dutch call it malt wine, but it's malt whiskey. And they want to make this whiskey, but this is 1660s. But you can't grow barley in the eastern seaboard of the U.S. It gets attacked. It's too hot and wet in the summers. It gets attacked by ergot. But they weren't going to not make whiskey. So they made whiskey from the other grain they came to plant with them, which was rye. Rye's like a weed. It will grow pretty much anywhere. And even if it gets attacked by ergot, it won't kill it. So they made the whiskey from the rye, but they made it from the rye the way they made the whiskey from the barley, which means they malted all the rye and made whiskey from it.
Sure.
And this style of whiskey has been an official category of whiskey since the United States has created the categories for whiskeys, even to this day. Malt rye whiskey has a different flavor profile from rye whiskey because it is sweeter, it has got more complexity, it is bigger in its mouthfeel. So the question is, well, then why doesn't everybody make malt rye whiskey? Well, it almost disappeared completely in the 20th century for a while until it was brought back by the old Potrero series from Anchor Distilling. And that's because malt rye as a raw material costs you 3 times as much as unmalted rye. And the flavor is different, but it's not that different. So the majors will probably never make this product because it's just too expensive. So it's made, we're like the second or third distillery in the country to make this style. The other one was Old Pogue down in Kentucky. And now there's probably maybe 8 to a dozen different distilleries that make this style, but they're all small distilleries. And it's one of my favorite styles of whiskeys. I like rye anyway, but I love malt rye. And the first one we did was a 1-year-old, then a 2-year-old, then a 3-year-old, and then the 4-year-old bottled and bond. And this is the favorite of my whiskeys.
The 4-year-old bottled and bond
Yeah.
steamship rye.
Right.
Malt rye.
This is the same medium char barrel as we use for the bourbons. For the younger whiskeys, we actually use a very high char. for the malt rye. The medium chard does not become drinkable until it gets to be 4 years old. And then we put down some whiskey early on and a very, very, very light char with a heavy toast. And then we finally bottled that a few weeks back as our 9-year-old.
9-year-old rye.
Malt rye whiskey, right. And it's called North American Steamship Rye because it's named after the SS North American, which was one of the 3 passenger steamships on the Great Lakes during the early 20th century. And we did that because one of my neighbors, who's now since passed away, Schofield Gross III, he was known as Scuffy, he spent 4 years during World War II as the bar boy on the SS North American, and they asked me to name my first rye whiskey after it, so that's what I did.
You're like one walking history lesson.
Thank you.
So where are you distributed at? Let's talk about your distribution. If I was to look for Quincy Street Distillery, where can I find it?
We're very tiny, but we make like 25 different spirits.
That's a lot.
Yes, it's really a lot. It's not a good business model because we make what we're passionate about, and we're passionate about a lot of things. Also, we make something as an intermediate product, and it turns out it's really good. So if we try to drop it for the next product, a lot of our customers complain. So it turns out what's interesting is that we are now with a small distributor, and that small distributor carries less than half of our products.
Okay.
And they place it in the northeastern part of the state. That's the territory they cover for us, which includes Chicago. And they've gotten us into some of the large retailers and some of the small retailers. And they've also gotten us into some bars and restaurants. And we were seeing that slowly growing over time. And then the pandemic hit. When the pandemic hit, it's really interesting because sales for liquor went up generally.
Yeah.
But for a lot of those very small brands, sales actually fell. And part of what was going on there was that the interest in terms of people purchasing liquor during the pandemic was mostly in cheaper brands. And one of the things we saw was that, look, if you want to get that extra skid of some, very inexpensive, popular national brand, that large distributor would also want to encourage you to maybe buy their craft brand. Since there's limited amount of shelf space on the craft brand, that could crowd out a small distributor quite effectively.
Sure.
So we found that we saw sales plummet about 80% during that period, and that in part reflected that restaurants and bars closed down. They were a lot of our business locally, and the small mom and pop shops found that they didn't have as much shelf space available. So we are rebuilding from that now that the pandemic is over. I would say we're probably halfway back.
So you're starting to see an uptick.
Yeah, but we thought that was going to grow really big, and the market conditions have become more competitive in the interim.
Sure. Where do they find you online?
Well, QuincyStreetDistillery.com, you'll find us. Of course, we don't sell directly online.
Right, but they can find the website as well as the address.
Yes,
and hours.
right, and we're on Facebook and Instagram and all.
And I can come in here and drink, right? I can come in
Yeah,
here.
we're at the bar. The bar is open 3 days a week, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. And we also do tours on Saturdays and Sundays. And the bar is a full cocktail bar. It's about doing craft cocktails, both classic and things that we've invented. And the key is we try to make the whole place feel like a 1918 speakeasy.
I hope you enjoyed this session, this history lesson with Derrick. I'm Jeff for the Great American Whiskey Cookers. See you next time.
Thank you. I'm over-degreed, as they said.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a biophysics undergrad, I have a history undergrad, I have masters in physics and material science, I have a PhD in physics, and now I make booze.
Hey, whiskey's all about sitting around, enjoying it with your friends and sharing it, which is what we're doing here. Join our Patreon page, and you never know, you might get invited out here to have some whiskey, play some games, and just have a good time. When you do join our Patreon site, you'll get access to exclusive content and some behind-the-scenes footage. Until next time. If you can't be good at it. See ya.
If you make it in the drink, what is that game, or is that like you lose? Ooh. With this stuff, it's probably you lose.
No. Come here and try this.